Hi there, welcome to Jville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. Grace Williams had always believed in the sanctity of marriage. For 18 years, she had devoted her life to her husband, David Johnson, a prominent and influential lawyer in Lagos. Their mansion in Ikoyi was a testament to David's success, with gleaming marble floors, pristine white walls, and crystal chandeliers that seemed to sparkle brighter than the love in their marriage. Grace had given up her dreams and ambitions to care for their home, believing that her sacrifices were for the good of their family. But over time, David had become cold, distant, and dismissive, leaving Grace in a hollow shell of what their love used to be. On the morning of their 18th wedding anniversary, Grace woke up with a faint sense of hope. She had spent days planning a romantic evening, a candlelit dinner with his favorite meal, jollof rice and peppered goat meat. She had even bought a simple yet elegant blue gown she thought he would like. She hoped the evening would reignite a spark in their crumbling marriage. But the day felt off. David barely looked at her during breakfast, mumbling a distracted good morning as he sipped his coffee and scrolled through his phone. Grace brushed it off. Maybe he's just busy, she thought, forcing herself to smile. As David left for work in his crisp black suit, he didn't mention their anniversary. She watched him drive away in his Mercedes, feeling a knot in her stomach. Something was wrong. The hours crawled by as Grace waited. She arranged the dining room table perfectly, flowers at the center, candles lit, and wine glasses sparkling. By evening, she slipped into her new gown, applied light makeup, and waited for David's return. When the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway caught her attention, Grace assumed it was a delivery. She stepped outside, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and froze. A large moving truck sat parked in the driveway. A tall driver stepped out, holding a clipboard. Behind him, workers carried out her clothes, shoes, and personal belongings. "What is going on here?" Grace demanded, her voice shaking. Before the driver could respond, David stepped out of his car with a smug expression. He glanced at Grace, unfazed by her confusion and anger. "You're leaving," he said curtly. Grace stared at him, trying to process his words. "Leaving? What are you talking about, David?" "I'm done, Grace," David said coldly. "I've been patient long enough. I want a divorce," he gestured toward the truck. "Your things are packed. I've arranged everything for you to leave quietly." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as the workers continued loading the truck. "You're throwing me out on our anniversary?" David smirked. "I have other plans. Tina will be moving in soon." The mention of Tina Adams, his young mistress, broke Grace. The humiliation, the betrayal, it was too much. In a daze, she walked to the truck where the driver, Michael, watched her with pity in his eyes. Without thinking, Grace grabbed the keys from Michael's hand, climbed into the driver's seat, and sped off, leaving David and his mansion behind. That night, the once faithful wife left Ikoyi with nothing but her pride and shattered heart. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the moving truck roared down the road. Her vision was blurred with tears, but the anger and betrayal pushed her forward. The sting of David's words echoed in her mind. "I want a divorce." The mention of Tina, the young woman who had replaced her, gnawed at her heart. After 18 years of sacrifice, this was how he repaid her. The man she had loved unconditionally had discarded her as if she meant nothing. The truck clattered over bumps, jolting her back to the present. Grace didn't even know where she was going. She just needed to escape the humiliation, away from the mansion, away from David's smug expression. The night had fallen over Lagos, and the busy streets were starting to quiet down. As the truck approached Surulere, a familiar place from her childhood, Grace finally pulled over. Her breath was shaky, and her tears came in sobs as she slumped over the wheel. A soft knock on the truck window startled her. She turned to see the driver, Michael, standing beside the truck with an expression of genuine concern. "Madam," he said softly, "are you okay?" Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand and shook her head. "How can I be okay?" she whispered bitterly. Michael nodded as though he understood the depth of her pain. "I don't mean to intrude, but driving like this isn't safe." "Where are you going?" I don't know, Grace replied, her voice breaking. She looked at Michael, realizing how ridiculous she must have looked, dressed in an elegant gown, crying inside a moving truck filled with her belongings. Michael hesitated before speaking again. If you need somewhere to go, there's family you can stay with, right? Family. That word struck a chord. Grace's grandmother, Mama Rose, had always been there for her. A strong woman who didn't believe in sitting quietly when life turned sour. Grace hadn't seen her in months, but at that moment, she needed Mama Rose's fierce love more than ever. Yes, Grace said suddenly, straightening herself up. Take me to Surulere. I need to see my grandmother. Michael offered a small smile and nodded. I'll drive. Grace reluctantly moved over to the passenger seat, letting Michael take the wheel. As the truck trundled through the city, Grace's mind raced. She felt like her life had fallen apart in the span of an hour. Everything she knew was gone, her home, her marriage, her sense of security. She glanced at Michael, who hummed softly as he drove, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her chaotic emotions. You're strong, Ma, Michael said suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace blinked at him. What makes you say that? Because you didn't stay there and beg, he replied simply. A lot of people would have. His words stayed with Grace as they reached Mama Rose's modest home in Surulere. The single-story house was a stark contrast to David's mansion, but it was warm, welcoming, and familiar. Mama Rose was already outside, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist and a wooden spoon in her hand, as if she'd sensed Grace was coming. Ijoma, she exclaimed, using Grace's Igbo name. Her eyes narrowed as she took in Grace's tear-streaked face. Grandma, Grace choked, running into her arms. Mama Rose held her tightly, her embrace full of strength and love. Who do I need to fight? She demanded, her voice filled with righteous anger. Grace let out a broken laugh through her tears. David, she whispered. Mama Rose's lips pursed tightly. We'll see about that, Nance. And just like that, Grace felt a small spark of hope flicker inside her. She wasn't alone. Mama Rose would help her fight back. The following morning, Grace sat in Mama Rose's modest living room, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. The small house smelled of freshly brewed tea and fried plantain, the kind of comfort food that always made her feel at home. Mama Rose sat beside her, her face set with determination. Despite her age, she had the energy and fire of a woman half her years. You mean to tell me, Ma Rose began, raising her voice, that after 18 years that man, David Johnson, had the nerve to pack your things and throw you out like common trash? Grace nodded silently, tears welling up again. She had barely slept, tossing and turning on the old bed in the guest room, replaying the betrayal over and over in her mind. Mama Rose stood abruptly, pacing the room as she tightened the wrapper around her waist. That man is wicked. This matter cannot end like this. Tufiakwa, you see this old woman, I will show him pepper. Grandma, please, Grace said, her voice soft. I just want to move on. Move on? Mama Rose turned sharply, her hands on her hips, so that he and that small girl, what's her name, Amarachi, they will enjoy the house you helped build. God forbid bad thing, Grace managed a small smile. Despite her heartbreak, Mama Rose's fiery spirit was infectious. She poured Grace a cup of tea and sat down again. Let me tell you, my daughter, you cannot allow people to walk all over you. If you keep quiet, they will think they've won. And this Mama Rose ain't I don't lose. Just then, a knock on the door startled both women. Mama Rose opened it to find Michael, the truck driver from the day before, standing there with a shy smile and a bag of bread. Good morning, Ma, he greeted respectfully. I just came to check on you. Ah, my son, come in, Mama Rose said, ushering him inside. Michael handed Grace the bread. I figured you might need something to eat. Thank you, Michael, Grace said softly, grateful for his kindness. Let's sit and eat, Mama Rose said with finality. Then we'll make a plan. That man David will regret the day he met you. That evening, the plan was set into motion. Mama Rose, with all the energy of a soldier preparing for war, convinced Grace to accompany her to David's mansion. Grace hesitated, but Mama Rose's persistence won out. You cannot let him see you broken, she insisted. They arrived at the mansion just after sunset. The house was quiet, the driveway empty. Mama Rose glanced at Grace. Follow me and don't be afraid. What are we doing? Grace whispered nervously. "You'll see," Mama Rose replied with a mischievous glint in her eyes. With surprising agility, Mama Rose slipped through the side gate, pulling Grace along with her. In the backyard, Mama Rose pulled out a can of spray paint she had stuffed in her bag. "We are leaving him a message," she declared. Grace stood frozen as Mama Rose began spraying words across the pristine white walls of the house. "Wicked man, homebreaker, and Mama Rose was here." "Grandma," Grace hissed, "you're going to get us arrested." "Good," Mama Rose replied unfazed. "Let the world know what kind of man he is." When Mama Rose had finished her masterpiece, she dragged Grace to the front yard and slashed the tires on David's Mercedes. "No man should disgrace my daughter and sleep well," she muttered. Just as they were about to leave, headlights appeared in the driveway. Grace's heart stopped as David's car pulled in. Amarachi, the young mistress, was in the passenger seat. David stepped out, his face contorting in fury when he saw his vandalized property. "What is the meaning of this?" David roared. Before Grace could respond, Mama Rose stepped forward fearlessly, holding her spray can like a trophy. "Welcome home, Mr. Johnson. I just came to remind you that the evil you do will not go unpunished." "You crazy old woman," David shouted, marching toward them. "Careful what you say," Mama Rose barked. "I'm old enough to be your mother." Security guards emerged, but before David could order them to act, Mama Rose grabbed Grace's hand. "Run," she cried. The two women bolted toward the gate, laughing breathlessly as David's angry shouts echoed behind them. By the time they returned to Surulere, Grace was laughing for the first time in months. "Grandma, you're unbelievable," she said, collapsing onto the couch. Mama Rose grinned triumphantly. "Let him stew. This is just the beginning." For the first time, Grace felt like she had regained a small piece of herself. Mama Rose had shown her that she wasn't powerless, and David would soon learn that too. The events of the previous night had left Grace restless but strangely empowered. Mama Rose had proven in her unique and mischievous way that David was not untouchable. Yet Grace also knew the consequences of their actions were inevitable. The following morning, as Grace sipped tea in Mama Rose's small kitchen, a loud banging erupted from the front door. "Who is banging my door like a mad person?" Mama Rose muttered, tightening her wrapper as she marched to answer it. The moment she swung the door open, two stern-looking police officers stood there. Behind them, parked outside, was a black police van. "Good morning, madam," one of the officers said, his expression unyielding. "We are looking for Grace Williams and Mama Rose. You are under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property at David Johnson's residence." Grace's heart dropped and she rose slowly, her face pale. "Arrest?" Mama Rose, unshaken, snorted. "So, that goat David finally called the police? Let him try me." She turned to the officers, her tone sharp. "My friends, I am an old woman. You better tread carefully." Despite Mama Rose's defiance, they were both escorted into the police van and driven to the station. Sitting on the cold metal bench of the holding cell, Grace felt her anger replaced with humiliation. The laughter she shared with Mama Rose the previous night seemed like a distant memory. "Is this my life now?" Grace murmured, holding her head in her hands. "Chin up, my daughter," Mama Rose said, patting her shoulder. "No shame in fighting back. It's that David who should be ashamed, not you." Just then, a familiar voice echoed through the hallway. "Where are they? I want to see my family." It was Mark, Mama Rose's nephew and a respected lawyer in Lagos. He stormed into the cell area, his tall frame and tailored suit commanding attention. "Auntie Rose, Grace, what have you two gotten yourselves into?" Mama Rose shrugged casually. "We taught David a lesson." "That man needed sense," Mark sighed heavily. "You can't go around vandalizing people's property, Auntie, even if they deserve it." He turned to Grace, his voice softening. "I'm sorry about all this, Grace." "I'll get you both out." Mark approached the officer in charge and began negotiating their release. His calm yet firm demeanor quickly worked in their favor. Within an hour, Grace and Mama Rose were free, though with a stern warning to stay away from David's property. As they walked outside, Grace finally spoke. "Thank you, Mark. I didn't mean for you to get involved." Mark waved her off. "Family takes care of family, Grace. Besides, that man's greed knows no bounds. You did what you felt was right." He paused and looked at her closely. But this is not the way to handle him. You need to focus on yourself now. Grace nodded, tears pricking her eyes. I just feel so lost, Mark. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think. Let's get you back on your feet properly. You deserve a new beginning. Back at Mama Rose's house, Grace felt exhausted. She sat on the couch, lost in thought, when Mama Rose joined her. You heard what Mark said, Mama Rose began softly. This is not the end for you, Grace. That man David has taken enough from you, your years, your joy, even your dignity. But what he cannot take is your spirit. Grace looked up at her grandmother, a small spark of determination in her eyes. What do I do now, Grandma? You start fresh, Mama Rose said firmly. We'll find you a job, something that gives you back your confidence. David must see that he has no power over you anymore. And what if I fail? Grace whispered. Mama Rose chuckled. My dear, you have already survived the worst. Trust me, failure is not in your blood. Grace managed a weak smile as Mama Rose pulled her into a hug. Outside, life in Surulere continued as usual. Children played on the dusty streets and vendors shouted their wares. But for Grace, a new chapter had begun. That evening, Mark returned with good news. I spoke with a friend of mine. There's a job opening at a small firm in Ikija. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. Grace hesitated, but Mama Rose clapped her hands in approval. Yes, that is what we need. Think about it, Grace, Mark said softly. You're stronger than you know. Take the chance. As Grace lay in bed that night staring at the cracked ceiling, she thought about the life she had left behind. The mansion in Ikoyi, David's cruel smirk and Tina's smug face, it all seemed like another world. I will rebuild, she whispered to herself, even if it takes everything I have. For the first time in months, Grace fell asleep with hope in her heart. The next morning, Grace woke up to the sound of Mama Rose humming softly in the kitchen, the familiar scent of akara frying filling the air. It was a small comfort after days of turmoil. As she got ready, she glanced at herself in the small mirror. Her reflection looked worn, the weight of her heartbreak still visible in her tired eyes, but there was also something else, a faint glimmer of resolve. You're going to be late for that interview, Mama Rose called, poking her head into the room. Grace adjusted the simple blouse and skirt she'd borrowed from her grandmother. I don't know if I can do this, Grandma. You can, Mama Rose replied firmly. You think strong women are born? No, we are made. Go out there and show them who Grace Williams really is. Her words stayed with Grace as she boarded the Danfo heading toward Ikija. The bustling energy of Lagos was everywhere, street hawkers weaving through traffic, horns blaring, and commuters squeezing into overloaded buses. Grace hadn't ridden public transport in years, and it was humbling. She clutched the paper with the job address tightly, repeating Mama Rose's words in her mind. When she arrived at Legacy & Co., a small but tidy legal firm, Grace hesitated at the door. Her palms were damp, and a voice inside her whispered that she didn't belong here. But she thought about David, the mansion, and the life he had stripped away from her. She refused to let his betrayal define her. The receptionist smiled kindly as Grace introduced herself. Please wait, Mr. Adekunle will see you shortly, she said. Mr. Adekunle, the manager of the firm, was an older man with glasses perched on his nose. He asked Grace about her experience, her strengths, and her willingness to start fresh. Grace was honest. She had spent 18 years running a household, organizing schedules, and supporting someone else's career. I may not have office experience, she admitted, but I can work hard. I learn quickly, and I know how to handle pressure. Mr. Adekunle regarded her for a long moment before nodding. You remind me of my late wife. She never gave up, no matter what life threw at her. You start on Monday as a front desk assistant. It's small, but it's a start. Tears pricked Grace's eyes, and she managed a small smile. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. Back at Mama Rose's house, Grace shared the good news. Mama Rose beamed proudly. I told you, no condition is permanent. That evening, Michael, the truck driver who had quietly become a constant presence, stopped by to check on her. He brought a small bag of groceries. Congratulations, Madam Grace, he said with a warm smile. I knew you would be fine. Michael, you don't have to keep doing this, Grace replied softly, embarrassed by his kindness. Ah, madam, life is too short not to help where you can, he said simply. They sat on the porch together, talking about life and dreams. Michael shared how he had struggled after losing his parents, but had worked hard to support himself and his younger brother. Grace found comfort in his humility and quiet strength. For the first time, she felt seen not as a failure, but as someone who could rise again. "Tomorrow is another step forward," Michael said as he left. "You'll see, everything will fall into place." As Grace lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, she felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She was no longer the helpless woman who had been thrown out of her own home. For the first time in years, Grace had something to look forward to, a job, a new purpose, and a glimmer of hope. And this time, no one, not even David Johnson, could take it away from her. Life began to take on a new rhythm for Grace. She woke up early each morning, took a crowded Danfo to Ikija, and settled into her new job at Legacy & Co. The tasks were simple: answering phones, filing paperwork, and organizing schedules, but each day Grace felt a little more like herself. The office environment was kind, and Mr. Adekunle often encouraged her, reminding her that small beginnings led to great things. Back in Surulere, Mama Rose watched her granddaughter with pride. "See you now," she would say, clapping her hands together. "You look like someone with purpose again." But while Grace was building herself up, David Johnson's world was slowly falling apart. In Ikoyi, David's life with Tina Adams was no longer the picture of perfection he had painted. Tina, once playful and charming, grew impatient with David's mood swings and arrogance. She was frustrated by his obsession with work and the lavish lifestyle he could no longer sustain. One evening, David returned home late from his office to find Tina angrily packing her bags. "Where are you going?" he demanded, throwing his briefcase onto the couch. "I'm tired, David," Tina snapped, her voice sharp. "This isn't what I signed up for." "What are you talking about? You live in a mansion. You have everything you want." Tina spun around, her face twisted with anger. "Everything? You think money is everything. You're bitter and selfish, David. You don't even care about your own family." She grabbed her suitcase and stormed out, leaving David alone in the grand empty mansion. For the first time, the silence felt suffocating. His mistress had abandoned him, and his former friends who once admired him for his power and wealth no longer returned his calls. At his firm, things were even worse. David's greed had caught up with him. He was representing James Okoro, a feared criminal accused of shooting a police officer. David had taken 100 million to defend him, promising to bribe the judge. But cracks began to show in the case, and rumors about David's shady dealings started spreading in legal circles. During the trial, James Okoro's fate was sealed. The jury declared him guilty, and in a fit of rage, James turned toward David in the courtroom. "You promised me," he shouted. Before anyone could react, James grabbed the bailiff's gun and fired. The sound of the gunshot rang through the courtroom, and David collapsed onto the floor. Chaos erupted as security wrestled the gun away from James. Paralyzed and barely conscious, David was rushed to the hospital. News of the shooting spread quickly. Grace was at work when Mark called her. "Grace, you need to come to the hospital," Mark said urgently. "It's David." Grace froze, her heart pounding. "What happened?" "He's been shot. He might not make it." For a moment, the memories came flooding back. 18 years of marriage, betrayal, and abandonment. She thought about the day he had thrown her out, smug and unbothered. "Why should I care?" she thought bitterly. But something deep inside wouldn't let her turn away. "Where is he?" she asked quietly. "St. Nicholas Hospital," Mark replied. When Grace arrived at the hospital with Mark, she saw Tina Adams in the waiting area, pacing impatiently. Her expression was cold and detached. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked. Tina turned to her unfazed. "He's dying, Grace. I can't take care of a crippled man. I don't even want to." The words hit Grace like a slap. Despite everything David had done to her, she couldn't believe how heartless Tina sounded. A doctor approached them. "Are you Mrs. Johnson?" he asked Grace. "Yes," Grace replied after a pause, her voice steady. "The bullet caused spinal damage," the doctor explained. "We need to know whether we should resuscitate him if his condition worsens." Tina folded her arms. "Let him go." "I can't deal with this." Grace looked at the doctor, her chest tightening. Do everything you can to save him, she said quietly. Tina scoffed. You're wasting your time, Grace. She grabbed her bag and walked away, leaving Grace alone with the weight of her decision. That night, David survived the surgery, but the doctors confirmed he was paralyzed from the waist down. When he woke up in his hospital bed, the first face he saw was Grace's. Confusion and shame flashed across his face. Why are you here? He croaked, his voice weak. Grace looked at him calmly. Because you needed someone, and everyone else has left you. David turned his head, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time, he felt the consequences of his actions. The life he had built with lies, arrogance, and greed had crumbled, and the only person still by his side was the woman he had betrayed. Don't get any ideas, Grace added firmly. I'm not here because I love you. I'm here because it's the right thing to do. David closed his eyes, tears forming. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone, and it was his own doing. That night, as Grace returned to Mama Rose's house, she felt conflicted. You're a good woman, Mark told her. David doesn't deserve your kindness. Grace sighed. Maybe not, but I deserve to live without bitterness, Mark. That's what makes me stronger than him. As she lay in bed, Grace realized she no longer felt like the helpless woman who had been thrown out of her home. David's fall was not her victory, but her strength was, and she was ready to keep moving forward. The days following David's return from the hospital were filled with tension. He had been discharged to his mansion in Ikoyi, paralyzed, bitter, and left with nothing but regret. Tina had long since disappeared, along with every trace of their so-called perfect life. She drained his bank accounts, sold off his valuables, and abandoned him without a backward glance. It was Grace who returned to care for him, though her heart felt no love for the man who had betrayed her. She had no reason to help him, but as Mama Rose put it, doing the right thing makes you bigger than your enemies. When Grace entered the house for the first time since she was thrown out, it felt strange. The once vibrant mansion now stood cold, dusty, and empty, an echo of David's downfall. Gone were the servants who once bustled through the halls. Even the laughter of Tina's children, which once mocked her, had disappeared. David sat in a wheelchair in the middle of the living room, staring blankly at the large television screen that wasn't even turned on. Grace walked in with a tray of food and set it on the table beside him. You can't expect me to eat that, David muttered, his voice sharp with anger. I'm not a child. Grace folded her arms and looked at him calmly. Then starve. It's your choice. David looked up at her, stunned. This was not the meek woman he had thrown out. Grace's eyes were steely, her voice unwavering. She turned and began cleaning the room, ignoring his protests. Days turned into weeks, and Grace's presence became a quiet but firm force in David's life. She cooked his meals, took him to therapy appointments, and ensured he was cared for, but she refused to coddle him. When he lashed out at her in frustration, she stood her ground. One afternoon, David exploded in anger. Why are you even here, Grace? Is this your revenge? Watching me suffer? Grace stopped wiping the table and turned to him. If I wanted revenge, I would have left you to rot in that hospital. David fell silent. You threw me out like garbage, David, she continued, her voice steady. You humiliated me. You tore apart everything I worked for. But I'm not here because of you. I'm here because I'm better than you. David looked down at his useless legs, tears welling in his eyes. For the first time, the reality of his actions hit him. The mistress he had chosen over his wife had abandoned him, and the friends who once flocked around him had disappeared. Only Grace, the woman he had discarded, remained, and she was stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Grace continued to rebuild her life. Her job at Legacy & Co. gave her purpose, and her co-workers grew to admire her resilience and work ethic. Mr. Adekunle offered her more responsibilities, and for the first time in years, Grace began to feel proud of herself. Michael, the kind truck driver, visited often, bringing small gifts and helping Mama Rose around the house. His presence was steady and reliable, and Grace found herself looking forward to his visits. You smile more these days, Mama Rose remarked one evening as Michael waved goodbye. Grace smiled softly. He's a good man, Grandma, a rare kind. Mama Rose raised her eyebrows knowingly. Good men don't come often, my dear. Don't let him slip through your fingers. Grace laughed but said nothing, though her heart was beginning to heal in ways she hadn't expected. At the mansion, David's transformation was gradual. With Grace's care and his therapy, he began to improve, both physically and emotionally. One Sunday morning, Grace was preparing breakfast when she heard a soft sound behind her. She turned, her heart stopping. David was standing. He leaned heavily on a walking stick, his body trembling, but he was standing on his own 2 feet. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he looked at Grace. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Grace stood frozen, the moment heavy with unspoken words. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," David continued, his voice breaking. "I see that now. You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it all away." Grace's heart softened slightly, but she knew the truth. "I forgive you, David," she said quietly. "Not for you, but for me. I won't carry the bitterness anymore." David nodded, his expression one of deep regret. For the first time in years, he saw Grace for who she truly was, a strong, capable woman who had survived everything he put her through. That afternoon, Grace packed her bag and stood at the door. "Where are you going?" David asked, his voice laced with fear. "To live my life," she replied simply. "You'll be fine. You have your second chance now. Don't waste it." She handed him a set of divorce papers already signed. "This is for both of us. It's time to let go." David watched her walk out of the house, his heart heavy. He knew he could never undo the damage he caused, but Grace had taught him a valuable lesson. Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much you want them to. As Grace stepped outside, the sun hit her face, and for the first time in years, she felt free. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated and discarded. She was Grace Williams, strong, independent, and ready to embrace whatever came next. And as she walked toward Michael, who waited by his truck with a warm smile, Grace knew that her new beginning had truly begun. The sun was setting over Lagos as Grace sat on Mama Rose's porch, sipping a cup of tea. The cool breeze brushed against her skin as she reflected on how far she had come. From being thrown out of her own home with nothing but humiliation and anger, she had risen. Grace had not only regained control of her life, but had discovered the strength within her she never thought existed. Michael parked his truck outside Mama Rose's compound and approached the porch with his usual calm smile. He carried a small basket of oranges and bread, a habit that had become familiar over the past few weeks. "Good evening, Madam Grace," he greeted warmly. Grace smiled back. "Michael, you really don't have to keep bringing things." Michael shrugged, leaning against the porch railing. "It's just my way of showing care, and besides, you deserve it." "How was work today?" "Better than I expected," she replied, setting down her tea. "Mr. Adekunle has been giving me more responsibilities. It's challenging, but I feel useful again." "That's good to hear," Michael said with genuine pride. "You see, I told you everything would fall into place." Grace nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace. Michael's kindness and steady presence had helped her heal in ways she didn't fully understand. He listened when she talked, encouraged her when she doubted herself, and treated her like someone who mattered. "Michael," she said softly, "thank you for always being there." Michael looked at her surprised. "It's nothing, Grace." Before he could finish, Mama Rose burst onto the porch, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist. "Ah, Michael, are you still here?" "This one that you're always coming here. It's like you're eyeing my granddaughter." "Grandma," Grace said, embarrassed. Michael chuckled, his face turning slightly red. "Mama Rose, I respect Grace. I just want to make sure she's okay." Mama Rose wagged a finger playfully. "Respect is good, but don't waste time. Good men are like good plantain. They don't stay ripe for long." Both Grace and Michael burst into laughter, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. Meanwhile, at the Ikoyi mansion, David sat alone in his wheelchair, staring at the signed divorce papers Grace had left behind. The silence in the house was deafening. Without Tina, without friends, and without his power, the man who had once commanded fear and respect was now broken. He had lost everything, but most painfully, he had lost the one person who truly cared for him, Grace. He thought back to all the ways he had mistreated her, all the sacrifices she had made for him that he never acknowledged. In his arrogance, he had believed that she would always stay, no matter how much he hurt her. I don't deserve her, he whispered to himself, tears welling in his eyes. But I hope she finds happiness. For the first time in his life, David Johnson truly understood the meaning of regret. Back in Surulere, Grace sat with Mama Rose after dinner, listening to the sounds of crickets and distant music from a neighbor's radio. Mama Rose's words broke the silence. You like that Michael boy, don't you? Grace blinked, startled. Grandma, what kind of question is that? Mama Rose grinned knowingly. Don't play games with me, Grace. I see the way he looks at you, and I see the way you smile when he's around. Grace sighed. Michael is kind. He's been a good friend to me when I needed one the most. Kindness is a foundation, Mama Rose said firmly. A man who treats you with respect is worth more than all the riches in Ikoyi. Grace thought about it for a moment, a soft smile playing on her lips. Mama Rose had a way of seeing things that Grace herself sometimes overlooked. A week later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Michael invited Grace to join him for a walk by the lagoon. The air was crisp, and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore created a peaceful atmosphere. Grace, Michael began, his voice steady but nervous. You've been through so much, and I admire your strength. I want to know that you're not alone. I'll always be here for you. Grace looked at him, her heart racing slightly. Michael, I don't want to rush you, he continued, meeting her eyes. But if you're willing to take a chance on love again, I'd be honored to walk that journey with you. Grace felt her heart soften. Michael had been patient, understanding and kind, a far cry from the man who had once broken her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in love again. Michael, she said with a small smile, I think I'm ready to try. Michael grinned broadly, his joy evident. Thank you, Grace. You won't regret it. As they walked hand in hand along the water's edge, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had survived, rebuilt herself, and now she was ready to embrace the future. In that moment, Grace knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was a woman who had fought back, risen stronger, and found love on her own terms. And that was more than enough. In the weeks that followed, Grace's life continued to blossom. Her job at Legacy & Co. flourished under Mr. Adekunle's mentorship, and she began to gain the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her worth. Clients smiled when she greeted them, and her attention to detail earned her praise from co-workers. For the first time, Grace felt proud of the woman she was becoming. Michael's presence in her life also brought a quiet peace. They spent evenings walking through the streets of Surulere, talking about life, dreams, and the little things that mattered. Michael didn't try to fix her, he simply stood by her, a steady source of comfort and hope. But despite her progress, a part of her knew she needed true closure with her past. She had moved forward, but the wounds David inflicted had not fully healed. It was time to face him one last time. One Saturday afternoon, Grace dressed simply in a blue blouse and a skirt. Mama Rose watched her closely. Where are you going, my daughter? To see David, Grace replied calmly. Mama Rose raised an eyebrow. You are stronger than me. Oh, if it were me, I would carry a cane there and remind him of who he insulted. Grace smiled faintly. I'm not going there to fight, Grandma. I just need to close that chapter. Mama Rose sighed, nodding in approval. Go then and hold your head high. You are not the same woman who left that house months ago. The Ikoyi mansion felt even colder and emptier than the last time Grace had been there. The once pristine gardens were overgrown, the house's walls dull with neglect. When she knocked on the door, it was David himself who wheeled to open it, his face worn and thinner than before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. David looked at her, his expression unreadable, before whispering, You came back. I came to talk, Grace replied softly, stepping inside. David wheeled himself into the living room, which now looked bare and lifeless. She noticed the dust on the surfaces, the unopened letters on the coffee table. The man who once lived in arrogance and excess was now a shadow of himself. Why are you here? David finally asked, his voice rough. To say goodbye properly, Grace said, sitting down across from him. I don't hate you, David, not anymore. But I can't pretend that what you did to me didn't change my life. David looked away, guilt evident in his eyes. I was a fool, Grace. I thought money and power made me untouchable. I see now that I had everything I needed right in front of me and I threw it away." Grace nodded, her tone firm yet calm. "It took me losing everything to realize how strong I really am. You may have broken me, but I'm not a broken woman anymore." David looked back at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Grace, truly. I wish I could take it all back." "You can't," Grace replied softly. "But you can change. You don't have to live the rest of your life in bitterness." David nodded silently, knowing she was right. Grace stood, feeling lighter than ever before. "I forgive you, David, not for your sake, but for mine. I deserve to move on without the weight of what you did." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Goodbye, David." David watched her go, the realization of his loss settling deeply within him. For the first time, he knew that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation, and it was Grace, not him, who had won. When Grace returned to Surulere, Mama Rose and Michael were waiting for her on the porch. Michael rose to meet her, his eyes filled with concern. "How did it go?" he asked softly. Grace smiled faintly. "It's over now, truly over." Michael nodded, taking her hand. "You're free, Grace. It's time to focus on the future." Mama Rose clapped her hands triumphantly. "Finally, you see, my daughter? You didn't just survive, you conquered." Grace laughed lightly, tears of relief glistening in her eyes. She had faced the man who had broken her, looked him in the eye, and walked away stronger. She had chosen herself, and that was all the closure she needed. The next morning, Grace joined Michael at his brother's church for the Sunday service. As the choir sang a joyful hymn, Grace closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She thought of the pain she had endured, the lessons she had learned, and the hope she now carried in her heart. When the service ended, Michael walked her outside and turned to her. "Grace," he said, his voice steady, "I know you've been through so much, but I also know that you are the strongest woman I've ever met. I want to build a life with you, one filled with kindness, love, and respect." Grace looked into his eyes, her heart full of gratitude and love. "I'm ready, Michael. For the first time in a long time, I feel ready." Michael smiled, taking both her hands in his. "Then let's walk this journey together." That evening, as the sun set over Surulere, Grace stood outside Mama Rose's house, watching children play in the street. The air felt light, the future full of promise. She thought back to where she'd been months ago, abandoned, broken, and humiliated. Now she was whole again. She turned to Michael, who stood beside her, and smiled. "Let's go home." As they walked together hand in hand, Grace knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, peace, and the happiness she had fought so hard to earn. In her heart, she whispered to herself, "I survived. I healed, and I have won." Months later, Grace stood in front of her modest new home in Surulere, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't a mansion in Ikoyi, but it was hers, a small, beautiful house filled with warmth and laughter. The sound of Michael's voice hummed softly from inside as he tinkered with a broken light bulb, and Mama Rose could be heard scolding a neighbor's child for kicking a ball too close to her garden. Life had come full circle. Grace was no longer the timid, heartbroken woman who had been thrown out of her own home. She had built a new life for herself, one of dignity, independence, and true happiness. The morning sun spilled into the living room as Grace prepared breakfast. Michael walked in, brushing the dust from his hands, and grinned at her. "You know, one day you'll trust me to fix something without glaring over my shoulder." Grace chuckled, handing him a cup of tea. "I'm just making sure you don't destroy my new house, Mr. Fix-It." Michael laughed, sitting down at the small dining table. "You know what today is, right?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "What's today?" 6 months since you opened your own place," he said softly, pride evident in his voice. 6 months since you decided to take control of your life. I think we should celebrate." Grace looked at him warmly, her heart fluttering. "I don't need celebrations, Michael. Having peace in my life is enough for me." Michael reached across the table and took her hand gently. "I know you've been through more than anyone should, but Grace, you deserve happiness, not just peace. You deserve to be loved the right way." Grace smiled softly, feeling the truth in his words. Michael had shown her what kindness, patience, and love truly looked like. He had given her the space to heal, but also the courage to believe in herself again. Later that day, Mama Rose hosted her usual Sunday gathering, a lively mix of neighbors, family, and friends. Children ran around the compound while women gossiped in corners, chopping vegetables and preparing meals. The small house buzzed with warmth and laughter. Grace moved through the crowd, smiling at everyone and feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. Mama Rose caught her arm as she passed. "My daughter, you are glowing," she said, looking at her with pride. "I told you there is life after heartbreak. Look at you now." Grace kissed her grandmother's cheek. "I wouldn't be here without you, Grandma." "Ah, don't flatter me. You did the work. I only added pepper to the story," Mama Rose teased, winking. As the evening fell and the compound quieted, Michael pulled Grace aside, standing under the warm glow of the porch light. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Grace," he began, "I've watched you rise from the ashes. I've seen your strength, your kindness, and your love. You've shown me what it means to fight for life even when everything falls apart. I don't want to waste another day." He knelt down, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Marry me, Grace. Let's build a life together, one filled with laughter, love, and respect. You deserve that." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the man who had stood by her through everything. This was love, real, steady, and unconditional. She nodded, unable to speak. "Yes, Michael," she whispered finally. "Yes, I'll marry you." Cheers erupted from the window as Mama Rose, who had been eavesdropping, clapped her hands joyfully. "Hallelujah, Michael, you did well." Weeks later, under the shade of tall trees and surrounded by close family and friends, Grace and Michael exchanged vows. It was a simple ceremony, no extravagant decorations, no pretentious displays, just love and laughter. Mama Rose danced proudly, leading the way as the crowd sang and celebrated. As Grace stood beside Michael, looking out at the smiling faces around her, she felt a peace she had never known before. This was her victory, not in riches, not in revenge, but in reclaiming her life and finding love again. Later that evening, as the party quieted down, Grace sat on a bench beside Michael, watching the stars appear in the Lagos sky. "Do you regret anything, Grace?" Michael asked softly. Grace shook her head, smiling. "Not at all. Every tear, every heartbreak, and every challenge led me here. And here is exactly where I'm meant to be." Michael wrapped an arm around her, and they sat in silence, the kind of silence that speaks of contentment and joy. In her heart, Grace knew that she had not just survived her past, she had conquered it. She had turned her pain into strength and found love on her own terms. She whispered to herself, her eyes still on the stars, "This is my new beginning, and it's only just the start." We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.